I want to welcome you again to another of our Institute Encounters, in which we have some extended conversation, very interesting extended conversation, with the distinguished academics who come here to provide lectures under the Institute's auspices. And today, it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Charles Stocking of the Department of Classical Studies of the University of Western Ontario. Dr. Stocking has made it his specialty to look at Greek athletics, about which he'll be talking this evening, but also to Greek culture, Greek religion, Greek gender relationships, and the way in which the ancient Greeks shaped our own thinking about many things, including themselves.
Yeah.
So, let me just welcome you and give me a sense of how you became interested in classical studies in the first place.
Well, that's sort of a funny story. It goes back quite far. My brother is actually a professor in classical studies at Occidental College, and he taught me Greek from a very young age. I started learning ancient Greek when I was 14, which is not part of the typical experience of a young American teenager. And from that point, it was really a matter of, it became an almost permanent part of my life, and not necessarily anything I was thinking would be a professional aspect of my life until I got to college and continued to pursue it, and sort of really just pulled me in from there. And so it's always been a sort of central part of my life, even from a familial perspective.
Now, you think that the Greeks very much remain with us today, that they're not just a historical foundation on which we've built, but they are ingrained in our very sense of the world. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, there's a way in which I think both classics as a field of study has continued to be informative in ways that we're not necessarily appreciating. But then also, there's a sort of history, I think, of people thinking about the Greeks, important people that has also influenced our own thinking. And for me, one of the ways in which we can see this in operation, very much so, is in the world of physical culture today. Really, I think the importance of physical culture in our own modern society is almost unparalleled in terms of in terms of larger world history, and in a large part that's a result of this desire or effort to return to an ancient Greek tradition that's part of a history of how we think about the ancient world and our relationship to it. And so a big part of my project has been to sort of expose and demonstrate how it is that the Greek tradition is influencing us in a way that is perhaps that we're not so aware of. So it's both a conscious effort to really bring to light some of these comparisons, and also, a practice in comparativism to think about how it is that our own modern physical culture is in fact very different at the same time.
Now, was there, if you look at other peoples and their history, did the Greeks bring something unique? I mean, clearly it's always been thought that both for war and hunting and things like that, people have to be physically prepared and have to train. Did the Greeks bring something unique beyond that in their view of physical culture?
Yeah, and I think, this gets to this question of how and why has it been so influential, and I think it perhaps is a function of not just the participation in physical culture and the valuing of it, but also the conscientious awareness of that value and elevating that value to the level of intellectual discussion. That is something that makes it almost a sort of meta level of discussion about the role of physical culture, to the point where, at least in the ancient world, it is so pervasive that we sometimes forget that it's even there. And it's just always lurking in the background, and it's really a sort of metaphorical view of so many other aspects of life.
So what was this kind of meta view
Yeah.
of physical culture. I mean, they saw it as serving purposes beyond mere exercise and readiness for various practical activities.
Right.
They saw something deeper in it than that. And what was that?
Yeah, and the question of what was that is sort of changes over time, essentially.
In Greek
In
history.
Greek history, and that also becomes an important aspect of how we perceive and receive that information in the modern era.
Mhm.
And of course, fundamentally, there's a religious component to ancient athletic practice that is both comparable and different from the modern world, and that's something I'll be talking about later today as well.
Well, let's not jump the gun on
Right,
that.
of course. But the sort of the religious component there,
Mhm.
I think, and in a way of conceptualizing the gods also, in some sense, as athletes or gods
Mhm.
with bodies becomes
Mhm.
important. But at the same time, we get, the development of Western medicine with Hippocrates, at
Mhm.
least the reception of Western medicine with figures like Hippocrates and later Galen, who are very much proponents of physical activity for the sake of health. And on the other hand, we have a very strenuous, program of athletic competition. And this idea of training the body for competition itself is something separate. And then lastly, we have this idea of knowledge of the body, essentially,
Mhm.
that both medicine and athletics were concerned with how we can understand the body in terms of what the ancients would call techne,
Mhm.
a form of what we might translate as expertise,
Mhm.
and how this idea of the expertise of the body can also relate to other forms of expertise, including philosophy
Mhm.
and different aspects like that. So, of course, Galen famously said the best philosopher is also a physician.
Mhm.
So there's this intimate connection between the body and knowledge, really, within the ancient Greek world.
This was a notion of philosophy as a way to live,
Exactly.
rather
Yeah.
than just as a body of abstract thought.
Exactly. Yeah. And so this becomes really a dominant metaphor, and it's something that we tend to forget. The very idea that athletics and education operated in the same place in the gymnasium,
Mhm.
as it were. So Plato's Academy was originally a gymnasium. And
They did that a lot better than we do. There are an awful lot of tensions, if you look at collegiate sports,
absolutely.
between the principles on which it is run
Mhm.
and the principles on which the rest of the university is
Yeah.
run, and the way in which they're integrated together,
Mhm.
even the people who participate in them. But that wasn't true in ancient Greece at all, was it?
There is a tension, and I think there's always going to be a tension there. And to what extent is it integrated or not? This becomes a question, even in terms of the value of athletics in the ancient world. Although highly valued, was also contested, primarily for these reasons: the concerns of health, moderation, balance. At least
Mhm.
from the evidence that we have of Hippocrates and Galen.
Mhm.
And so there is some way in which, yes, it was very much integrated. And that could also be a function of the difference in the role of the gymnasium in the ancient world as opposed to what our objectives are in a modern education system, for instance. But
Raise money.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's an interesting dynamic there, and I think there's a way in which those tensions are there, and in the ancient world as much as the present, and there's a way to sort of think about them in comparison with each other that can perhaps help us think about the modern world as well.
Did this survive the eclipse of the Greeks as the dominant cultural influence? I know the Romans, of course, continued the tradition.
Yeah.
But what happened immediately thereafter? Is sort of lost in the Middle Ages?
And this is something that this is an area of research that I'm really starting to delve into now. And we can see it almost as a sort of black hole, as it were, that needs to be brought out, is this aspect of physical culture, because of course we do have the desire to renew this notion of ancient Greek culture in the Renaissance, and athletics is a very much an important part of that, and the representation of the body. So what's happening after this time period? We do have at least some evidence of this happening in the 1500s, and so a sort of call to return to the ancient Greek tradition, which is interesting And of course, there's a religious component here.
There were some efforts in Britain, weren't there, in
Yeah.
the 16th and 17th centuries
Absolutely,
that
yeah.
have Olympic-like events.
Exactly, yeah. And so there's this idea, I mean, the fact is that the human body never goes away.
Yeah.
So it's just the value that we place on it that starts to fluctuate. And
As a collective phenomenon. I mean,
Yeah.
our own do.
Exactly, yeah.
That's right.
Most of it, yeah, exactly, yeah. And that's perhaps also the problem, and one of the things that athletics is always dealing with is the ephemeral nature of the body.
Mm-hmm.
And at least for the ancient Greek perspective, there's a way in which athletics was a way to conceptualize a brief moment of permanence, as it were.
So is there an athletic discontinuity? I mean, is the Middle Ages a period, again, people are training for war, there are combat sports, but is there any sense of athleticism as a civilian pursuit that persists during that period?
Yeah, and this is, and again, an area where I'm hoping to do more research, and we do have at least, moving towards the later periods, we have this idea of essentially the present era is, deficient compared to the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's a great work by Rubens, the painter and sculptor,
Mm-hmm.
On the imitation of sculpture, which he actually calls to return to the Greeks to improve the modern physical condition.
Mm-hmm.
But what interests me is this idea of the deficiency of the present vis-a-vis the past happens to be a sort of permanent aspect of different phases of history, that there's this continual desire to return to the past, even in the past. So even, our earliest sources talk about a desire to return to a past that was physically superior to the present.
The golden age.
Exactly.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so this discourse of the golden age somehow persists throughout the multiple phases of history. So whether or not people are genuinely physically better or not is almost beside the point, because this notion that the past is better than the present has persisted. Perhaps there might be a shift today with this a greater concern for the future, and perhaps less of an obsession with the past. But
Yeah. Well, of course, the development and notion of progress and the Enlightenment
Exactly.
certainly represents something of a shift.
Exactly.
How did the Greeks? I would think, and I'm just sort of imagining here. I don't really know, and you're probably inventing the first literature on this subject. So that if you had gone in at the height of the Middle Ages, not the Renaissance, but say the High Middle Ages, 12th century, something of that sort, and you had suggested to someone that who was a member of the aristocracy,
Right.
that they should be jumping and running and hurling things. Again, I'm just supposing here that they might have thought that was too much like physical labor, like what peasants did. They might have seen the advantages of riding and using their swords and things like that, developing the strength to do those things. But they might have seen other types of physical competition as beneath them.
Right.
I don't know if that's true, actually, but this is kind of an extended speculation. Did the Greeks have to handle that tension, the notion that in working out, you were doing something manual and hence something base? Does that occur as a problem in Greek thinking?
It does, and there's certain levels of sort of elitism that's involved with athletics, and we have a famous case for Alcibiades, right, the sort of political playboy of Athens, who in a case, the team of horses, which is after Alcibiades' death, there's a sort of prosecution because he owes people money, because he entered an unprecedented number of chariot teams in the Olympics, and it explains that he decided to enter chariots as opposed to competing in the athletic events, because those were beneath him, essentially, and that the most elite people would not be involved in those. And this gets into a large debate that's currently going on.
If you had a chariot, you didn't drive it. You hired someone to do it, right?
There was somebody else, so it was the owner of the chariot.
Right.
And so there's a way in which the athletic competition is, in some sense, strictly a function of aristocracy and elitism and wealth and physical wealth, as opposed to the use of the body. So there was perhaps some stigma at least attached to this, but again, there's other occasions in which we do have evidence for aristocrats competing in these competitions.
From what social strata were most athletes in ancient Greece drawn?
And this is a huge debate
Mhm.
currently, and there's arguments that it's completely sort of open, and others that there's a certain amount of wealth and money is required simply to participate in the training to become a professional athlete or to become a competitive athlete. And so this debate continues today, and it's really, I don't know if we can definitively say at this point that they came from a single social strata.
Did they have sponsors who helped them prepare?
Again, the evidence for this is difficult, at least in the early period.
Mhm.
We do have, much later in the Roman period, a lot of evidence for professionalization and what are called synods, these sort of athletic guilds. But again, this is part of the history of scholarship on athletics, has been to see this Roman era or Roman imperial period as a decline. And again, that's part of the sort of notion of the amateur
What
ideal.
were these guilds like?
They were essentially involving different groups that would go on tour in athletic competitions.
I see.
There's different categories, and
They were doing the events we associate with the Olympics.
yeah, of course. But at that point, the program had expanded so much, and athletics was perhaps more popular than even in the classical period. And so, as a function of this, there was essentially more money involved. But again, this issue of the status involved with athletics, Galen again talks about this, and there's a sort of problem with the manual pursuit of excellence, or what's called arete, that eventually this will wear out, and it's much better to pursue the intellectual side. But again, Galen is an interesting figure. As a physician, he had an extremely anti-athletic attitude in the ancient world. But of course, the criticisms are also an evidence of the popularity of its role.
One of the things you don't see much of, the only counterexample I can think of is in terms of chariot racing in Rome. You don't see team sports in the ancient world, certainly not to the extent that we have them now, even in the Olympics, where you have a variety of team events.
Exactly.
Is there some significance to be attached to that?
Yeah, I mean, and I guess the question is, what is the nature of the significance? And part of that, I think, deals with what historical time periods we're dealing with. So, for instance, there were many team events, but these would actually be involved with things like the Panathenaea, the sort of procession and athletic festivals in Athens, in which there were in fact group events and group rewards that related to civic institutions.
So what sort of group events were there?
So, for instance, there's the torch race, from which
is a relay race.
Right, a relay race, and we don't know the precise details of what was involved and how exactly one competed in it. But we do know that there were, in fact, the rewards were for the entire tribe that participated, as opposed to single individuals.
So what would happen then is the people who ran as a team would be related to each other? They'd be kin?
Either kin, or there's also civic groups. So the actual tribes in Athens that would be divided up, and a breaking apart of kin groups in order to redefine them in terms of civic institutions and civic belonging.
Were there what other kinds of team sports were there?
There was at least a fair number of others. There was sailing, or rowing events as well.
So there'd be a number of people in a shell,
nautical,
so to speak.
yeah, exactly. Nautical events. We also have different team events in Sparta, specifically related to their civic festivals, Carnea, and different forms of ball games and things like that.
They had ball games.
Yeah. So, and again, this is one of the unfortunate facts of ancient athletics, is our knowledge of how these things were actually practiced is very obscure. So
we dig up kind of ball fields in which...
No, we just have really textual evidence referring to some of these events, and some vague descriptions of them. So we don't know the rules and things like this.
So the Greeks invented team sports too. We can add that to the list.
I think it's most definitely that team sports is very, very much a part of it. and there's these different contexts in which they would be valued. And it's interesting that at least the Olympics becomes the predominant way to understand ancient athletics, but that was simply one aspect of ancient Greek physical culture.
Now, the Spartans had an area for women to participate in athletic events, but that wasn't true very much elsewhere, was it?
Well, we do have some evidence, for instance, for essentially the equivalent of an Olympic festival in honor of Hera in the ancient world, from Pausanias and other descriptions. And the only event that would be practiced there would be the stadium, the sort of running race. And so there was a sort of female equivalent.
And those were, there would be people from women from different cities participating.
Yeah. And there are questions as to what was the function and purpose of this event. It's not entirely clear. Some people argue that it's a form of initiation, others that it is just an equivalent practice to the Olympics. But what is important is that they did participate not only in the athletic events, but in the religious festivals associated with it, sacrifice, receiving prizes as part of the event as well. So it is true, it's an unfortunate fact that there's very limited evidence for women's participation in sports, but it was very much a part of the ancient world.
It was separate from
yeah, it was separate. And again, we do have Sparta is sort of this model, at least in the reception of Sparta, as a place where it was in fact more integrated. But there's this question with Spartan culture, which is how much of this is a part of Spartan culture and how much of it is a part of what's called the Spartan mirage.
Which is what?
The reputation of Sparta in the ancient world, and to what extent is this a perpetuation of the reputation as opposed to the actual practices that were happening in Sparta. So Sparta itself becomes a source of
kind of
major imagination for the Greek world as a whole.
People project their fantasies onto
yeah.
even in those days.
Yes, absolutely.
What was the relationship of athletics to religion?
And this is something that I think more work needs to be done on. There's an assumption about...
Which is not true today.
Exactly, yeah. There's this question of course, the division of these things, and some people would argue that sports is a religion today in and of itself, as opposed to a part of it.
Right.
But, where do you go on Sunday, right? This relationship between religion and sports, and religion and athletics in the ancient world is very closely tied by the very fact that each of the festivals were these athletic festivals were religious festivals, and there's the level of engagement, of course, is there. I think the logic of ancient athletics is informed fundamentally by their conception of the gods as, in some sense, anthropomorphic, or what we might call theomorphic.
They're athletes themselves.
Yeah, and then also from the very fact that athletes, one of the prizes for athletic competition was participation in sacrifice, and sacrifice itself becomes this point of both division and separation, not only of the animal but of human and divine communities. And so the fact that athletes are participating and involved in sacrifice is very much a part of an expression of their, what we might call a sort of continued or common community between humans and gods, but a sort of sliding scale of separation between them.
Now there is a tradition, and we had as an earlier part of our Olympics event, the screening of Chariots of Fire.
Yeah.
There is a kind of muscular Christian tradition.
Absolutely.
In which exceeding or being excellent as an athlete is a way of praising God because you're taking the gifts He's given you and you are developing them to the kind of extent, the ultimate extent which He would have wished or He wishes. Do the Greeks think that way?
This gets to be a complicated question. I mean, this idea of sort of muscular Christianity itself is fascinating because of this connection to suffering. I think that's very much a part of that. And on the other side, you mentioned this idea of the gifts that God has given you, and this is something I think that is very literal in the ancient world.
Mhm.
A conceptualization of physical strength itself. The term, one of the terms is kratos. At least in our earliest poetry, Homer and Hesiod, it's understood as something that is literally given to you by the god. So as opposed to conceptualizing strength as strictly a physical feature of our individual persons, or what we would call genetic, that it does come from an external source. And there's a process of reciprocity, of gift exchange really with the gods, to engage in this idea of God's giving you physical strength, and then in turn you repay them with, well, the question is, what do you repay them with? You repay them with honor. The ancient Greeks called timon.
And also by displaying what it is they have given you.
Exactly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a very interesting point there, which I think is fascinating, is just the sheer contingencies that are involved in competition and the role that the gods play in these. That victory itself was understood as a divine moment, and not simply a function of cause and effect. It's not training and the result. So this religious aspect there is very much there, and I think really I'm very fascinated by this notion of God-given strength, just because for the Greeks there's very much this is a literal as opposed to a metaphoric understanding of something that is a gift, but then requires a return gift to the gods in exchange for that.
So we've lost the notion, except for people who are imbued with a global religious sense will find religious meaning in whatever it is that they do. But by and large, our games are entirely secular. If we worship anything, we worship ourselves, rather than the gods. You've probably explored the origins of the modern Olympics to some extent.
Yeah.
Was there any sense among Coubertin and other people who were involved in its founding that they were doing something that had a religious significance?
Absolutely. And I mean, Coubertin really framed...
Was he religious himself?
His own religious beliefs. I'm actually not too familiar with his own religious beliefs, but I have studied his writings on the relationship between religion and athletics, and he argued for what's called a religio athletae, a sort of religion of the athlete, but of course this of the athlete, is it the athlete's religion or is it worship of the athlete? And there's an ambiguity there. But he really wanted to model the modern Olympic movement on the ancient and really make athletics itself what he considered to be a political religion. And he says, and this is something that we'll talk about, but instead of honoring the gods, one honors country, race, and flag. So I guess if we follow Coubertin's logic, it would be the nation state itself would take the place of the gods.
So how would the Greeks view that attitude towards athletics?
I think there is a personal connection to the gods that's very separate, at least, and the nationalistic element, or we could say the polis-oriented aspect. Of course, it's always there, and we get this conflict in the ancient world.
I suppose race too, because they did not admit non-Greeks until the Romans came along who made offers they could be refused.
Right,
but they didn't admit non-Greeks to the.
Yeah, and again, this is this is an exciting time period in the study of ancient athletics, because we're exploring a lot of this sort of common knowledge and questioning these things. So whether
maybe there were some non-Greeks.
So for instance, could be very strong evidence that non-Greeks participated, and at least even as far as thinking about figures, like the Sicilian tyrants are participating in the Olympics, and we get into
Greeks,
and we get into this question of what constitutes ethnic identity at this point, and perhaps participation is also a function.
So if you were a Hellenized non-Greek, maybe that was good enough.
Right, and and so
where is the evidence that people like that participated?
So for instance, we do have in Herodotus, Philip I participating.
So he's a marginal Greek,
right, and has to prove his ethnic identity and things like this as well, according to Herodotus, whose own questions are about what exactly does it mean to be Greek. So, I guess, there's this way in which we can think about
this. Persians competing?
Not as far as I can tell,
Yeah.
but yeah, but again,
A lot has been lost.
exactly, yeah. But I guess this idea of the sort of nationalistic side of modern sport, we do have that very much in the ancient world, where we'll have victory statues that will praise the city-state that the athlete comes from without necessarily even mentioning the athlete.
And they give free meals too, and for life to victors.
Yeah,
within the
and there's
individuals
different
who stay.
evidence for that. So,
Right.
for instance, in Athens, we have the idea that there would be sort of free meals for life, and the idea of the representation of, the civic qualities.
So they were proud of their own.
Absolutely, yeah.
Would you find statues of successful athletes in various cities from which they came?
Yeah, most definitely. And we
Uh-huh.
have a lot of evidence for this, and the evidence even for cult worship of certain
Oh, really? They were
figures.
deified, huh?
Yeah, well, not quite deified. So there's a separate category for hero worship that is neither mortal nor immortal, but it occupies an interesting liminal space. So a figure named Theagenes of Thasos, for instance, is a famous athlete that was worshipped as a hero.
What did he win?
He won many events. He was a very accomplished athlete, mostly in the combat sports.
Oh.
And his statue was thought to have magical properties at a certain point, and healing powers and things like this. So there's an interesting tension between the individual and the city-state from which the athlete came from, and a question of sort of aristocratic versus civic ideology that is also being played out in the ancient Olympics as well as in other events. And of course, I think this is something that is still very much a part of the modern athletic movements. Is it the praise of the individual or the country from which they come?
Mm-hmm.
It still exists as a tension, I think.
Right. Would there have been in ancient Greece a notion that certainly still is true to a degree, perhaps was truer in the earlier phases of the modern Olympics, of a kind of brotherhood of sport in which people kind of recognize their competitors as kind of honorable, thought that there was some notion that it was important to obey the rules, perhaps rather than just win. It's how you play the game and all that kind of stuff. Was that something that was part of the ancient Greek world?
I mean, again, this is it's a very good question. It's an interesting question to think about, sort of the modern perspective here. And of course, there's the famous modern Olympic creed, which is, what's important is not the win, but the struggle. And of course, you have this preeminent value placed on victory on the one hand in the ancient world. At the same time, you do have, for instance, the Zanes, these sculptures that were erected from the fines to athletes who cheated, right, as a warning against athletes not to cheat. But in that case, it was very much, again, a religious perspective, that you made your promise before Zeus that you would not, and violation.
But Zeus wished you to do that.
Right.
So which suggests that that the code had moral value.
Yeah, and a violation of these athletic competition rules was not simply a violation of rules, but it was a religious violation as well, against the oath before Zeus. So there was a religious component there as well. So, but this question of the brotherhood of sport, I mean, it was so much a part of their civic institutions as well that I don't know if there was anything else, perhaps is a way to think about it, because it was integrated into what it meant to be a citizen as well. So, but of course, competitive sport at the Olympic level and those certain athletes is different from the basic athletic training that every citizen would participate in.
What would be the basic athletic training for every citizen?
Well, again, our evidence of what was involved, we have very little
And
evidence.
this would be mandatory for free adult citizens?
Yeah, and whether it was mandatory or not, again, we don't necessarily have the evidence, but we do know that there were public gymnasia and citizens would participate in athletic training by not a professional coach, but somebody that's called a paidotribe, somebody who trains the person through basic different maneuvers.
Well, we're not clear as to what they actually did in this training.
Yeah, exactly. What was involved, this is sort of the mystery always, is how is it that ancient Greeks got the bodies that are represented in sculpture.
Was it assumed that most of them actually had bodies like that?
Well, of course, this is another one of those issues, is that our access to ancient physical culture is always through their representations. And what did, how did they actually look? And the Greek sculpture itself has become a source of imagination
Oh.
for this.
Was there a
hypervalue.
tradition of mockery for people who were not fit?
We do have some evidence for certain things like this in comedy, for instance, in
Yeah.
Aristophanes. But again, we don't have necessarily a lot of evidence for this. So, the question of the value of fitness, we're always limited. It's this eternal frustration of the classes.
Except for
Limited by
depicting
evidence.
comic characters, or maybe
Exactly.
some of the kind of gods of indulgence.
Right. Yeah.
You don't find kind of fat people or very scrawny people in Greek art, do you?
Yeah, and you get into this question of realistic representation and what is real versus not, and what is idealized.
You've talked about hyperrealism. in
Yes,
Greek art.
absolutely.
What do you
yeah.
mean by that?
So what I mean, I rely on a notion of hyperreal conceptualized by the philosopher Jean Baudrillard, which is really the idea that reality derived from images as opposed to the reverse. So what we could also call a reverse of mimesis, where we think that an object of representation is based on, on something that's real.
Mm.
But what happens when we model ourselves or attempt to model ourselves on representations? And Baudrillard had said that this was a function of postmodern society, the proliferation of images.
Uh-huh.
And part of my argument is that this proliferation of images existed in the ancient world. An art historian, Nigel Spivey, said that there's a city of sculptured physiques
Mhm.
in the ancient world. An entire population, as it were, of bodies, of representations, so that perhaps the ancient world was exposed to the image, in a comparable way that we are today.
So if you were out of shape and you were walking through Athens, you constantly see examples in statues
Right.
of what you should be,
Ex-
but lamentably fell short of.
Right, and there's this, one of the fundamental questions here is there that sense of the obligation to, this sort of negative repercussions in feeling that you should be like this or not? There's a question of, is that pressure physically there or not, or is this simply the way that they imagine the gods and not necessarily thought about themselves? And
Mhm.
this is a debate happening in art history today as to the sort of moral implications of physical appearance and how sculpture can or cannot reflect the ancient world in that way. And unfortunately, our texts are surprisingly or frustratingly silent. We have a few examples where rhetoricians say, for instance, Isocrates says, nobody can make the nature of his body like an ancient sculpture. So there's a sort of acknowledgement of that impossibility
Mhm.
there as well. So the question of the status of the image and its relationship to the ancient Greek psychological perspective is something that
So
needs
it's
to be
hard. It's
understood.
hard to say whether Greeks were more comfortable with their bodies than people today.
Exactly, yeah. And to what extent was the conceptualization of the gods, to what extent was that prescriptive for how we should think about modern, or how the ancients should think about their own bodies?
So what would you say, if do the Greeks have any lessons for us today in terms of either physical culture or how we view our bodies?
I think one of
would
the
be useful.
I think one of the important things to understand, at least what the Greeks provide for us, or at least the ancient Greek tradition, is a platform for thinking about this and the multiple perspectives that are involved. We want to attribute to the ancient Greek tradition a single perspective that we can then apply or aspire to. But understanding the multiplicity of perspectives in the ancient world allows us to sort of negotiate these views in the modern world. And this is something I try to do with my students very much, is to demonstrate these various attitudes and to consider how it is that we conceptualize our own bodies. And again, there's this great point in second sophistic rhetorician Philostratus.
Second sophistic means Roman period?
Roman imperial period, who talks about kairotic training,
Mhm.
this idea of kairos, the right moment, that training and the conceptualization of the body is always a matter of negotiation. And so rather than looking for a single prescriptive account, using it as a way to think through things
Mhm.
without necessarily coming to a single definitive answer.
Well, the Greeks are really great on teaching us how to think through things.
Exactly,
weren't
yeah.
they?
And making the body a part of that is something that I think is very much present in our own society, but something that needs to be brought out more to be able to think through our own relationships to our bodies and vis-a-vis the past.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Steve.
That was an excellent foretaste of what we'll get more of later today.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.